early tradition has been dated to within 5 years after Jesus' crucifixion. And thus, you have in the early Christian tradition the naming of specific eyewitnesses and groups of people that were widely known in the early Christian church who at least claimed to have seen Jesus of Nazareth alive after his death. Now, we can write these off as hallucinations if we want to, but we cannot responsibly deny that they occurred. And that's why, for example, Paula Fredrickson in the ABC special says that as a historian, I must conclude that these men sincerely believed that they saw something, and this something changed their lives. So for that reason alone, as I say, it's virtually unanimous among New Testament scholars that these early disciples, groups and individuals, did in fact experience these post-mortem appearances of Jesus alive after his death.
Now let me ask you, how many people do you think Jesus appeared to after he arose from the dead? Was it just to a few individuals? Was it to just believers? The answer is no. And historian Dr. Gary Habermas takes a look at the evidence, and I think it may surprise you. Listen.
Of course, the key list there is in 1 Corinthians 15. In that list, you have individuals, leaders of the church. Paul starts with Peter, ends with himself. In the middle has James, the brother of Jesus. 3 key individuals who saw the risen Jesus. But you also have groups, and that's very important to ascertain some evidence for these appearances. You have the 12. You have a group he calls all the apostles. You have more than 500 brethren, most of whom remain alive. Now, when you go to the Gospels, and I think also with good grounds, we have, for example, the women. You have several women at the tomb, and probably Mary Magdalene alone as she returns. So you've got them citing Jesus as well as the empty tomb. And again, if you're going to put your best foot forward, you do not use women because they can't go to a law court. You're not going to impress people in first century Palestine. By far the best reason for starting with the women and secondarily with Mary is very simple. They saw the risen Jesus. Now the Gospels also tell us about a long walk with 2 men on the way to Emmaus. I mean, it takes a while to walk and talk for miles with this visitor who turns out to be Jesus. You have appearances to the groups of disciples. You have in John 20 all the disciples present except, of course, Judas and Thomas. You have a second appearance a week later with Thomas in the famous incident where Thomas asks for evidence. A chapter later, John tells us about the disciples fishing on the seashore. And again, Jesus comes and he sort of makes a shore lunch for them, and they're looking at him from the shore. And, you know, Peter, impetuous as ever, dives in to try to beat the guys with the boat carrying all these fish, and they talk to Jesus there on the shore. So you've got a wide range of activities. You've got men and you've got women. You've got individuals and you've got groups. You've got indoors, outdoors, sitting, standing, fishing, making a shore lunch, walking with them, hanging on by the ankles, wide variety.
You are listening to The John Ankerberg Show, featuring leading historians, theologians, and archaeologists as they present the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead.
Therefore, the historian, whether that historian be a secularist, a Muslim, a Christian, whatever, the historian has to say, how do we explain the fact that this movement spread like wildfire with Jesus as the Messiah, even though Jesus had been crucified? And the answer has to be, it can only be because he was raised from the dead.
Well, in terms of the psychological profile of the disciples, if we believe that it is true that they denied, deserted, and betrayed Jesus, that they had given him up for lost when he died on the cross, psychologically, something significant had to have happened to change all of their minds about this particular issue after the crucifixion of Jesus.
Now, wait a minute. I'm using your facts. You don't believe the conclusion. What's this missing X? What do you think really happened? They usually at that point will opt out of the discussion any way they can. But if they do take a naturalistic theory, my assertion is the known historical facts, those admitted by all scholars, are sufficient to refute those naturalistic theories, as well as give the best evidences for the resurrection.
One of the most respected historians in the world, writing on the life of Jesus, is Dr. N.T. Wright. He's canon theologian of Westminster Abbey in England. For 22 years, he taught at Oxford University. And I asked Dr. Wright why he and other historians are persuaded that the disciples believed the risen Jesus appeared to them. How can you explain the Christian church after Jesus' life?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because the origin of Christianity is actually itself one of the most extraordinary phenomena in the history of the world. AD 20, there ain't such a thing as the Christian church. By AD 120, the emperor in Rome is getting worried letters from one of his proconsuls off in northern Turkey about what to do about these Christians. So in that century, you have this extraordinary thing suddenly appearing out of nowhere. And all the early Christians for whom we have actual evidence would say, I'll tell you why it's happened, it's because of Jesus of Nazareth and the fact that he was raised from the dead.
Now, critical scholars accept the fact that the disciples believed Jesus appeared to them. But then they ask, what did the disciples really see? Did Jesus stand before them in his literal physical body? Or did they experience a vision or an hallucination of Jesus? Well, Dr. Ben Witherington tells us.
Most scholars would certainly say the disciples believed that they saw Jesus. And many of them would just want to leave it there and say, okay, it was a subjective phenomena that happened here. But if you interpret those gospel documents about the resurrection appearances of the risen Lord, and you interpret the Pauline evidence, the rest of the New Testament evidence, they were claiming far more than that. They were claiming to actually have a physical encounter with Jesus after his death, that he ate, that he was tangible, could be touched, that he was still moving in space and time as a real person. So they were claiming more than just having had a vision of Jesus.
In general, talk to those people that ignore all of this evidence and all of the sources supplying the evidence for these 4 or 5 facts that you've given, and just simply say, well, it's not the resurrection, but yeah, something happened.
Well, I think the key here is the way we framed the discussion. We started with facts which virtually all scholars hold as one. And you got this list. We've narrowed the list down arbitrarily to say, look, I don't even need that many. You've given me way too many. Now, when you frame the discussion on the critic's ground, what you're saying is something like this. I know the New Testament says a lot more than this, but I'm not asking for the whole New Testament. I'm just asking you for this narrow amount that you've given me many times in your books. So you can't walk away from this and say, well, some wonderful things happen and we don't know what. No, for a moment, let's not think about what we don't know, what the critic thinks we don't know. Let's talk about what we do know, because what we know, and those 5 facts in particular, the 12 facts more generally, what we know is sufficient to refute the naturalistic theory. So again, let's not hide behind, well, granted, something happened. No. You've given us enough facts here to say the earliest eyewitnesses believed they saw the risen Jesus. We need an alternative if the answer is not going to be they really saw him. But strangely enough, most scholars won't take that route, either in their books, in dialogues. They won't take that route. They feel like they're trapped. If I take this theory, you're going to be coming after me. We'll say, no, wait a minute. I'm using your facts. You don't believe the conclusion. What's this missing X? What do you think really happened? They usually at that point will opt out of the discussion any way they can. But if they do take a naturalistic theory, my assertion is the known historical facts, those admitted by all scholars, are sufficient to refute those naturalistic theories, as well as give the best evidences for the resurrection.
To the person that's listening to you and just crossed the line intellectually and said, doggone it, all right, it happened.
Yeah.
What's the next step?
I think that the next step is to realize that Jesus of Nazareth holds the key that unlocks the door to eternal life. Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me shall never die, and though he die, yet shall he live. Death, I think, is man's greatest existential enemy because it puts all of human existence with a question mark behind it. What is the meaning and significance of my life if ultimately I live only to die? And if the human race as a whole lives only to die? And the resurrection of Jesus tells us that the grave is not our ultimate destiny, that ultimately our destiny is eternal life and fellowship with God that is available through faith in Jesus Christ as he promised. So I think that the resurrection of Jesus, if it occurred, is something that it has tremendous existential significance for every human being, because it holds the key to purpose and meaning in life here on earth and in the life hereafter.
Now, what if you're persuaded in your mind that the historical evidence shows that Jesus actually rose from the dead? Did you know that just believing that in your mind doesn't make you a Christian any more than being a church member makes you a Christian? What should you do? Well, first,